Now we're going to turn to how you discharge contracts, essentially getting rid of the contract and satisfying them. One way, obviously, is performing the contract, discharges the contract. That's the most obvious way. And so that ends the contract between the parties. Both parties perform and we're done. Contracts can also be discharged in lots of other ways. So let's talk about them. One is what's known as changed circumstances. And here we're talking about when an event occurs after the contract has been executed. In other words, after both parties have agreed, something happens, and the non-occurrence of that thing happening was a basic assumption of the contract. So let's say the contract has to do with what was going to happen on a sailboat, and then the sailboat, in the meantime, catches fire, and now there is no sailboat. And so a basic assumption of the contract was that there was going to be a sailboat. So if that event, whatever it is, makes performance of the contract impossible, and the party seeking discharge didn't assume the risk of the non-occurrence. Sometimes you sign contracts where you assume the risk that, I don't know, maybe it will be thunderstorming that day and you won't be able to go out on the sailboat. That's not quite the same thing. So if you didn't assume the risk, it's now impossible. It was a basic assumption of the contract. The event occurs after they formed the contract, then that is an impossible contract and it can be discharged. In analyzing whether to do that, a court will ask whether, was it really a basic assumption of the contract? Was it really unforeseen? Is it really true that it's now impossible, or is there some way? Could we get another sailboat, for example, to do the contract? Is it really true that neither party explicitly assumed the risk that this thing would happen? But assuming all of that is true, then it may be that it is now impossible for the contract to be performed. Another way we might get an impossible contract getting discharged is if some law change happened that makes performing the contract legal at the time the contract was entered into, but illegal by the time the performance happens. That would also be something that would probably get discharged for impossibility. Discharge for impracticability is basically the same thing, except here, instead of performance being impossible, it's that performance is impractical. It's unduly burdensome. In some way, somebody would have a more significant loss or hardship than had been anticipated in the initial contract. And finally, you could have discharge by frustration of purpose. Same idea, an event occurs that was unforeseen, that's important, that was an assumption of the contract, and somehow it frustrates the purpose of the contract. And therefore, the exchange loses most of its value as a result of the event, such that the purpose of the contract is destroyed. You could get discharged that way. How else could you get discharged from the contract? Well, the contract, there could be rescission of the contract. Mutual rescission occurs when both parties agree to rescind the contract. And in order to be valid, there still has to be some aspect of the contract remaining that each party has not yet performed. Obviously, if one party has fully performed and the other one hasn't, it's not going to be a mutual rescission. So if both parties still have something left to perform and they get together and they say, you know what, let's just stop there and not perform the rest of it, that's mutual rescission. Unilateral rescission occurs when one party desires to rescind a contract, and there courts will allow it if the party seeking to rescind has legal grounds to avoid enforcement of the contract, such as by demonstrating undue influence, fraud, duress, things like that. But you really have to show that the contract was really not legal in the first place in order to do the unilateral rescission. And another way to discharge is by what's called novation. And a novation occurs when a new party assumes the obligations and benefits of the contract, and so the prior contract goes away. So if there's a contract and then all the parties agree to a new contract that will supersede the first contract, that's called a novation, and that ends the old contract and creates a new one. And then there's discharge by accord and satisfaction. And accord represents an agreement by which the original promisee agrees to accept something different in performance from the original promisor in exchange for a release of the original agreement. So if you and I have an agreement that you're going to do, let's say, paint the fence for $100, and then some way in, it's really sunny, you're really hot, and you say to me, tell you what if I paint half the fence and you give me $50 because it's too hot and I want to go home, and I agree to that, that's an accord. It's essentially a modification of the contract. And then satisfaction means that I perform whatever the accord agreement, you actually paint that half of the fence. That would be satisfaction. And so that ends the contract because you offered a slightly different performance scheme, I agreed to the performance scheme, and then you did the thing that has now been agreed to. That's enough to discharge the overall contract.